Yeah. The Ramchal said that this book is going to, although the points that he's making in this are, in his opinion, are on the third page. It doesn't have numbers. You should number the pages. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're on page 4. Can be proven philosophically, scientifically, with all sorts of investigations and proofs, academic, but he is assuming that the knowledge that he's going to put down over here about Jewish faith and Jewish outlook is based on our tradition. That means what we know about God, although he claims, he doesn't talk out, he claims that it's provable philosophically, he's going to base it on Jewish tradition. Jewish tradition goes back to the patriarchs, it goes back to the prophets, and it goes back to the Jewish people as they stood at Mount Sinai, and there they became aware of God as he really is. Okay, so the points that he put down, point number 1 is that God, what we call God, is an existence that has always been there. There was never anything beforehand, always will be there, and it brought everything that we know into existence. That's point number 1. See you. Have a good trip. Number 2 was that God is perfect. Perfect means that he has no deficiencies. We know these, he says, through tradition, which was passed down because Moshe Rabbeinu was commanded by God to tell the Jewish people they should pass this tradition, meaning what they witnessed at Mount Sinai about the reality of God, they should pass on to their descendants. Okay? That's where we're up to. Point number 3. Point number 3, hechrech mitziusai. The word hechrech usually means by force. Well, by force means it's necessarily true. You understand what I mean? Right, there's no other way it could be. It's in addition, it's necessary to know this reality, this existence, which we refer to as God. His reality, mitzias muchrach. It is something that has to be. It's not like, I suppose what he's trying to say, it's not like God to choose at some point not to exist. Mitziuto, his reality, mitzius muchrach, is a reality that has to be. It's not only does God has to exist because otherwise there would be no universe, right? That's because God brought the universe into existence. He's saying God has to be, not that he suddenly appeared at some point. Okay? But I think he's in addition. Before he was saying that God has always been here, right? So he's already said that God didn't appear at some point and suddenly, no, he's not saying that. It's more than just God's always been, that God has to exist. Not has to exist in order that anything else should exist. He's not saying that, right? No, he's not saying that. He says God, I think the point, God couldn't decide he doesn't want to exist. Which is an interesting concept, right? I mean, like we said, does that mean God's limited because he couldn't decide not to exist? Well, not really. It just means that, yes, limited, but so what? God's limited. We never said that God isn't limited. We said that God is perfect. God doesn't have any deficiencies. It's not a deficiency that you couldn't decide not to exist, right? It doesn't mean you're powerless. On the contrary, you're so powerful. So, hello? Here, please take a copy. You're taking my car's copy here. All right? But the problem I think that we have with this concept is a very fundamental concept I don't really know much about, but if God is forced to exist, thank you very much, then the universe is really a contradiction to that. Because there's God decided to not exist there, in a sense, in a certain sense. It means the universe is not perfect. The universe is not God. It's something where God is not, or something where God is less, or something where God is not as apparent. So, and I was told that's why the creation, instead of really being called yesh me'ayin, which means God created from nothing, it was really the other way around. Before there was a universe, there was yesh, that means there was God everywhere, for a better word, right? Yeah. And then he created a reality where he didn't exist to the same extent. Right? It's what's called tzimtzum, whatever that means, but that's the word used for that. And yeah?
What does that word translate to directly?
It means to constrict.
Is that the correct translation, or is it just a translation where it's kind of close enough?
I'm not sure why it's important. That means the word tzimtzum is not a biblical concept. It's just a word used to describe this concept of HaKadosh Baruch Hu constricting his infinite reality and making something which is not infinite, which is the universe. So if God can do that, then he's really choosing not to exist. To a certain extent, right? Well, then why can't he just continue that more and more and more? So, to the extent that that's possible, I would have thought that it's like a bit of a contradiction. But I know this is a problem. The fact that God can create a universe and therefore not fully exist, and that's the debate about how to understand Tzimtzum, and therefore I'm not going to go into it because I don't really know anything about it. Anyway, that's the basic idea he's saying over here, that God, by force exists, and he doesn't really have a choice to not exist. I think that's the point he's saying over here. Daled. You want a copy of this? There's a copy here. What's your name? Shlomo what?
Weiss.
Shlomo Weiss. You've not met before, have we?
No,
Okay, Shlomo Weiss. You're doing Derech Hashem for a few minutes, and then we'll get to Navi, if that's what you expected. Daled, fourth point, says the Ramchal. Heyoto bilti nisle ba'acher. The fact that he is not, Heyoto means his being, bilti, not, nisle, dependent, ba'acher. No, God is not dependent on anything else. Which I suppose is an automatic consequence of the fact that God's always been here, which is what we said in Allah. Because if God depended on, and he was before anything else, and if he depended on something else, then he wouldn't always be here. So he says like this. There's also another point that you need to know. God's existence, reality, is not dependent on anything else at all. Not on us, not on the universe, not on angels, not on our prayers. God exists totally independent of anything else. He is, by force, exists on his own without anything else. Hey, Peshi Tusai. This is a very interesting one. It's a bit of a long piece. Peshi Tusai means God is Pashut. What does Pashut means? Simple. Yeah, not simple in duh. No, it doesn't mean that. Okay? No. Pashut means straightforward, not complicated, not complex, not parts, in no way at all. It's just straightforward. Let's see what he means. It's also important to know the reality of God, Metzius Pashut. It is simple, beli harkava, without parts. Harkava is when you put things together, when you like Lego. That's called parts. God isn't parts. V'ribui klal, or lots of different pieces at all. V'chala shleimuyot kulam, all God's perfections, all the points where we say God is perfectly seeing, capable, just, powerful, clever, all those points of perfection, nimtza imbo, exist in him, b'derech pashut, in a simple way. So that doesn't make so much sense. He explains himself. Pirush, what do I mean? Kihine, now he gives a mashal to contrast. The mashal means when you see something else which contrasts, which is different, you understand what we mean. Because it's very difficult to understand this straightforward, because we don't really, he's going to say later on, because we don't really have any reality to compare it to. Nothing that we see in our lives, in our existence, is simple, so that we can say God is like that. All we can say is God is not like what we see. Okay? Yes.
So basically, it's simple as in not complex, meaning like I can only do so and so if so and so happens. That's the complexity. So
okay, let's how he explains it. For example, let's give an example. Kihine, the nefesh, in our own soul. Yimtzu kochot rabim shonim. When we say the word soul, it doesn't mean to say the nefesh as opposed to the neshama, the ruach, whatever. The nefesh is our spiritual side as opposed to our bodies. Okay? I don't know if he means which part of the nefesh. It's not important, right, for the purpose of this discussion. The nefesh, in the nefesh, yimtzu kochot rabim shonim. There are many different strengths. Shekol achad mehem gidro bifnei atzmi. Each one has its own domain. Each one has its own separate function, own area of existence. Daled mem means derech moshel. For example, e.g. In English we would say e.g. In Hebrew we say daled mem. Derech moshel. Derech mashal. Daled mem. Derech mashal. For example, hazikaron, your memory. Koach achad is one type of strength that your soul has, that you can remember things. Haratzon, the desire. You want to do things. There's also an expression of the soul. It's a different strength. Hadimyon. Dimyon means your imagination. Koach acher is another strength. Right? There all may be functions of the mind or the brain and different parts of it. There's no. Each thing has its own area and domain, and each one's function separately. They can all work together, but each one's separate too. Kihine geder hazikaron, geder echad. The domain of memory is one domain. Geder ratzon, the geder of desire, geder acher is another one. Ve'ena ratzon nichnas begeder hazikaron. One doesn't enter the other one's domain. V'lo hazikaron begeder ratzon. I remember. I want. I desire. What was the other one? I imagine. V'chein kulam, the same is true in anything. Acha adon yitbarach shemo. With God, it's not like that. Einono bal kochot shalom. He isn't a person with different strength. Afal shi be'emet yesh bo inyanim. Even though he does have all these things, God does have a memory, and God does have a desire, and God does have an imagination, but they're not functions of different things. Even though in truth, yesh bo inyanim shebanu heim. He does have those things that in us they are separate. Ki ha'rotzeh, he does want. Hu chacham, he's wise. Hu yachon, he's able. Hu shalem, and he's perfect. B'chol shem, and all the different points that we talked about. Omnam, however, amitas mitziyusa hu inyan echad. His reality is one thing. Shekolel be'amitato v'gidro, which includes in this reality of God and in its domain. Domain here doesn't mean area of. There's another, just a way of saying something. Yeah. Kol ma'ashehu shleimus, all the perfectionness. The nimtze sheyesh bo kol hashleimiyot, and he has all these perfect points. Lo kadavar nosaf, but not as a thing added to his reality. That means you exist and you have a memory. You could exist without your memory, or you could have a desire, or you could exist without your desire. They're all things added to your reality. In God, they're all parts of this one thing. Lo kadavar nosaf amuto v'amitat inyano. They're added to his reality and his and the truth of his existence. Ela mitzad amitas inyono ba'atzma. They're actually expressions of his simple existence. Shekolelet be'amata, which includes in its truth kol hashlemiyot, all these perfect points. That reality which we called God couldn't exist without all these points. Now, although I don't understand what I just said, right? And he's about to say the same thing. What I just said is very, very far from us being able to grasp and to imagine what that means. You can't really imagine anything that we've never seen or studied. What does it mean? It doesn't really mean very much. Right? Because we've only seen things where our knowledge and our memory and our imagination and our desire are all separate functions of one human being. But in God, they're not different things, they're just one thing. And what does that mean? How can different expressions be one thing? It's almost impossible to explain what I just said. Or words lefarshot to explain it. The reason is simple. Because what we picture within your mind and our imagination, tofes can only grasp ela inyanim mugbalim. We can only imagine things which are limited. Bigvulateva, which was within the limits of nature. Hanivra, which was created mimenu from God Yisparach. Shazem mashechushenim. That's what our senses feel. Our senses feel and send pictures to our brain. What we see and feel with our senses, we can picture in our brain. Ubivruim, and in created things that we experience, all these things are separate and many, and there's no way to see them as being one thing. Ulam, but as we said, we've already introduced the idea, the reality of God really is impossible to grasp. And therefore, you can't compare to what we see, Babruim, with those who created. We won't really compare what we are to. On the contrary, all we can do is contrast it. So how do we know it's true? If we really don't have words to express it, and we really can't grasp these ideas intellectually, why do we think that it's true? Like, where do we get it from that it's true if we don't even have a word? Like, how did this thing start? We imagined it, we worked it out, so he already told us. How did it start? From Har Sinai. That means we as Bruim, as physical beings limited by our natural senses, what we sense only with our five senses, are limited to things that we experience through that. But Har Sinai, we weren't limited by that, because Har Sinai was a prophetic vision. And there we became aware of this reality. Once we had that reality and we understood that God was more than just a conglomeration of different ideas that we are, and then we passed that on, and that's how we know it. That's what he said. As he says, the two things are not comparable means man and God. That we should compare one to the other. This is also one of the things we know through our tradition. And therefore, that's what we accept. Like we wrote. Okay. I think we'll stop there and we'll go over this last piece tomorrow and we'll carry on. Okay, so back to Shoftim.